But in leaving, she had been forced to abandon everything else. Her childhood home, her grandparents, and Ethan Miller. Her first love, the boy who held the other half of her heart. Now, at 25, she was back. A quiet phone call from her grandfather about her grandmother Jolie's declining health had been the only push she needed. She was a literature teacher now, and she had taken a position at the local high school, a practical reason to justify a return that felt anything but. She squeezed the small silver locket around her neck, a final gift from her mother. "I'm back," she whispered, the words tasting of fear and resolve. The moment she stepped into her grandparents' house, the scent of gingerbread and pine wrapped around her like a warm hug. Jolie, looking frailer but with the same loving light in her eyes, held her tight. "Oh, my girl," she cried, "you're finally home." The house was a minefield of memories. As she walked through the familiar rooms, decorated for Christmas just as they always had been, the past rose up to meet her. She could almost see her father in his favorite armchair by the fire, hear her mother's laughter in the kitchen. And by the window seat, she could almost picture Ethan, his easy smile waiting just for her. They were just memories, ghosts of a life that had been stolen from her, but they still had the power to make her ache. "Are you ready for this, Tess?" Jolie asked later, her voice gentle. "I have to be," Tessa replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. The next day, Tessa went to Northwood High to meet the principal before her first official day. The school was small and welcoming, a stark contrast to the imposing institutions she'd attended in England. As the principal, Mrs. Gable, showed her into the staff room, Tessa's eyes scanned the walls, taking in the usual school notices and calendars. Then she saw it, a polished wooden plaque dedicated to the school's donors. Her gaze drifted down the list of names, and then it froze. One name stood out, etched in brass, impossible to miss. Ethan Miller, principal benefactor. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A cold shock, followed by a confusing electric warmth, shot through her. He was still here. After all these years, he was still in Northwood, and apparently he was successful, very successful. Mrs. Gable noticed her staring. "Ah, our town's guardian angel," she said with a proud smile. "Mr. Miller is an incredible man. He grew up here, you know. Saved this school from bankruptcy a couple of years back." Tessa couldn't speak, her throat suddenly tight. "Actually," the principal continued, glancing at her planner, "he's coming in for a meeting tomorrow morning to discuss the new library wing. You'll get to meet him then." Tessa didn't sleep. The night was a long, restless tumble of old memories and new anxieties. What would he look like? Would he be married? Would he even remember her? The questions circled in her mind, chasing away any chance of rest. By the time she arrived at the school the next morning, she felt hollowed out, running on pure nervous energy. She tried to appear composed, professional, but her hands were clammy and her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She was in her new classroom, unpacking a box of books, when she heard them. Footsteps in the hallway, firm, confident, decisive. They stopped outside her door. The handle turned, the door swung open, and the world tilted on its axis. It was him, Ethan Miller. The years had sharpened the familiar lines of his face, adding a new layer of maturity and strength. He was taller than she remembered, his presence filling the doorway, commanding the space with a quiet, powerful authority. He was no longer the lanky, easy-smiling boy she had loved. This was a man. Their eyes met across the room, and for a single, breathless moment, everything else ceased to exist. The school, the 8 years of silence, the ache of their shared past, it all vanished. There was only the shocking, undeniable jolt of recognition, a current of electricity that arced between them, as powerful and as real as it had been all those years ago. The spell was broken by the cheerful, oblivious voice of Mrs. Gable, who had appeared at his side. "Ah, Tessa, perfect. I'd like you to meet our benefactor, Mr. Ethan Miller. "Mr. Miller, this is our new literature teacher, Miss Tessa Parker." Ethan's expression shifted, a mask of cool, polite professionalism sliding into place, but his eyes couldn't hide the storm she had seen there. The shock, the flicker of old pain, and something else. Something that looked dangerously like longing. "Miss Parker," he said, his voice a low, formal rumble as he extended his hand. "Mr. Miller," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. She placed her hand in his. The contact was electric. A jolt of warmth, of familiarity, shot up her arm, a ghost of 1,000 touches from a lifetime ago. They dropped their hands quickly, as if burned. The meeting that followed was torture. They sat on opposite sides of a table while Mrs. Gable detailed plans for the new library, but neither of them seemed to register a word. They were acutely, painfully aware of each other, the air between them thick with unspoken questions. After the meeting, as Mrs. Gable was called away to her office, Ethan sought her out in the now empty hallway. The silence was heavy, awkward. "So, you're back," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "My grandmother hasn't been well," she explained, clutching a stack of books to her chest like a shield. "I wanted to be closer." "I heard," he said. "I'm sorry to hear that." The conversation was stilted, a painful dance of polite formalities between two people who had once shared every secret. Tessa's mind screamed with questions. "Why did you never call? Did you forget me? Did you ever love me at all?" But the words wouldn't come. He seemed about to say something more, then stopped, a look of conflict crossing his face. "Well," he said finally, his voice flat. "Welcome back, Tessa." He turned to leave. Tessa watched him go, her heart sinking with the weight of all the things left unsaid. He reached the end of the hallway, his hand on the door to the exit. He stopped. For a long moment, he stood there, his back to her. Then, without turning around, he spoke, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it. "I thought about you every day, Tessa." The words were a quiet, raw confession. Every single day. And then he was gone, leaving her standing alone in the silent hallway, the echo of his words shattering the carefully constructed narrative of indifference she had built around her heart for 8 long years. That night, she sat with her grandmother, the day's events replaying in her mind. "Vovo," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Ethan, when I left, did he ever try to get in touch with me?" Jolie stopped knitting, her hand stilling in her lap. She looked at her granddaughter, her expression turning serious, her eyes full of a gentle, pained wisdom. "Oh, my dear," she said softly, "we need to talk." Jolie set her knitting aside and reached across the small table, her warm, wrinkled hands covering Tessa's. The gesture was gentle, but her eyes were filled with a gravity that made Tessa's stomach clench. "He tried, my girl," Jolie said, her voice soft but clear, leaving no room for doubt. "Oh, how he tried. Ethan tried to find you." The floor seemed to drop out from under Tessa. The words didn't compute. For 8 years, she had built her entire emotional defense around a single painful truth. Ethan had moved on. It had been easy for him. The silence from his end was proof. That belief, as agonizing as it was, had been a shield. It had allowed her to be angry, to feel wronged, to justify the wall she had built around her own heart. What do you mean?" Tessa stammered, pulling her hands back as if the truth were too hot to touch. "He never wrote. He never called. I never heard a single word." "Because your aunt and uncle wouldn't let him," Jolie stated simply, her gaze unwavering. Tessa stared at her, speechless. Jolie sighed, a deep, weary sound. "In those first few months after you left, that boy was beside himself. He called here, asking for your number in England. He wrote letters, begging me to forward them. He was heartbroken, Tessa, just as broken as you were." Jolie recounted the story, each word dismantling a brick in the wall of Tessa's long-held resentment. Ethan had finally gotten the international number from a mutual friend. He had called, desperate to hear her voice. But it wasn't Tessa who had answered. It was her aunt. Your aunt and uncle. They thought they were doing the right thing, Jolie explained gently. They saw how much pain you were in, how you were struggling just to get through each day. They told Ethan that hearing from him, being reminded of the life you lost, was making it worse. They told him that you were finally starting to heal, to make new friends, to build a new life. They asked him, if he truly loved you, to let you go, to give you a chance to forget. The image was devastating. Ethan, young and grieving himself, being told that his love was a source of pain for her. He fought it at first, Jolie continued, but they were relentless. They convinced him that his silence was a gift, the most loving thing he could do for you. And so, because he loved you more than anything, he did it. He sacrificed his own heart to give you peace. A sob, thick and ragged, tore from Tessa's throat. It was a sound of 8 years of misplaced anger, of profound, wasted sorrow. They hadn't just taken her away from her home. They had stolen her love story, rewritten her past without her permission. How could they? That night, sleep was impossible. The new truth warred with the old pain. She had to see him. She had to tell him she knew. She had to apologize for all the years she had wrongly blamed him. Fueled by a desperate, frantic energy, she got in her car and drove. She found his address online, a modest, renovated farmhouse on the outskirts of town, a place that spoke of quiet success, not ostentatious wealth. She pulled up across the street, her courage faltering. The house was dark, save for a warm light in the living room window. As she sat there, trying to work up the nerve to walk to the door, the front door opened. Ethan stepped out, followed by an elegant, sharply dressed woman with a confident air. They stood on the porch, talking. Even from a distance, their rapport was easy, familiar. They laughed at something, and then the woman leaned in, giving him a lingering, affectionate kiss on the cheek before turning and walking to her own car. Tessa froze. Her heart, which had been filled with a new, fragile hope, shattered all over again. Of course, 8 years was a long time. He had moved on. She was too late. Without a second thought, she put the car in reverse, her tires crunching softly on the gravel, and fled into the darkness, a fresh bitter wave of heartbreak washing over her. The next day at school was an exercise in quiet agony. Tessa moved through her classes in a fog. The image of Ethan and the elegant woman on his porch burned into her mind. She saw him in the hallway between periods, and instead of meeting his gaze, she ducked into an empty classroom, her heart pounding like a trapped bird. She couldn't face him. Not now. The hope she had felt had been foolish, and the shame of her late-night flight was a hot flush on her cheeks. Her avoidance did not go unnoticed. At the end of the day, she sought refuge in the school library, a quiet sanctuary of dusty books and hushed whispers. She was pulling a worn copy of Wuthering Heights from a shelf when his voice, low and firm, came from directly behind her. "You were at my house last night." She jumped, dropping the book with a loud thud. She spun around, her face instantly turning a deep shade of crimson. He stood there, blocking the narrow aisle, his expression unreadable, but his eyes intense, searching. "I saw your car pulling away," he continued, his voice softer now. "You were going to knock, weren't you? Why did you leave, Tessa?" She couldn't meet his eyes. I saw you were with someone," she stammered, staring at the faded carpet. "I didn't want to interrupt." A long silence followed. Then she heard him let out a soft, almost amused sigh. "Tessa, look at me." Reluctantly, she lifted her gaze to his. "That was my lawyer," he said, a small, wry smile touching his lips. "Her name is Catherine. She was dropping off some urgent contracts for me to sign. The kiss on the cheek? That's just how she says hello and goodbye to everyone, from the mailman to her 80-year-old grandfather. Tessa stared at him, feeling a wave of profound, idiotic relief wash over her. A lawyer. Of course. He took a step closer, his smile fading, his expression turning serious, vulnerable. I haven't been with anyone, Tessa, he confessed, his voice a low, raw whisper. Not seriously. Not since you. He paused, the weight of his admission hanging in the silent library. I couldn't. The simple, honest confession broke through the last of her defenses. All the pain, the misunderstanding, the years of silence. It all melted away in the face of that one, stark truth. My grandmother told me, she whispered, her own voice thick with emotion. About my aunt and uncle, about the phone calls. I'm so sorry, Ethan. For all these years I thought, shh, he said, closing the small space between them. It's in the past. We were kids, and they thought they were protecting you. They stood there for a long time, simply breathing in the same air, letting the truth of their shared past settle around them. Finally, they began to talk, really talk. Sitting at a dusty table in the back of the empty library, the years of silence fell away. He told her about the army, the desperate need to escape the ghost of her in their small town. He spoke of the harsh realities of his missions, the discipline and the darkness, and how it had forged him into the man he was now. He explained how he had used that strategic mindset to build his security company from the ground up. She, in turn, told him about England, about the crushing loneliness of being a stranger in a strange land, of burying her grief in books and studies. She spoke of the constant, quiet ache of missing him, of missing home. They laughed over old memories, of sneaking out to go stargazing, of their first clumsy kiss behind the bleachers. The connection, the easy, unspoken understanding that had always been between them, sparked back to life, stronger and more mature now, tempered by time and hardship. Let me take you to dinner tonight, he said, as the evening light began to fade outside the library windows. A real dinner. No misunderstandings. No ghosts. She looked at him, at the boy she had loved, and the man he had become. And for the first time in 8 years, her smile was full of pure, unadulterated hope. I'd love that. That night, at a quiet, discreet restaurant, the conversation flowed as easily as it had in the library. As they were finishing their meal, a man in a sharp suit approached their table, his face lit up with recognition. Ethan Miller. Man, what a surprise to see you out and about. Congrats on the new government contract. That's huge news, the man gushed, clapping Ethan on the shoulder. Ethan smiled politely, clearly trying to downplay the attention. Thanks, Mark. Good to see you. Seriously, it's inspiring, the man continued, oblivious to Ethan's discomfort. From soldier to security mogul just like that. The Miller Tech story is one for the books. Ethan managed to politely end the conversation, but the man's words lingered in the air. Government contract? Mogul? Tessa looked at him, a question in her eyes. Ethan had said he owned a security company, but he had been vague, humble. The scale of what the man was describing felt different. Later that night, back in the quiet of her room, Tessa's curiosity got the better of her. She couldn't shake the man's words. She opened her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She typed in the words she'd overheard. Ethan Miller, Miller Tech Security. The first headline that appeared made her jaw drop. Miller Tech Security lands $300 million government contract. Private equity fund buys stake, valuing company in the billions. She clicked, her heart pounding. Article after article detailed the meteoric rise of his company, his innovative blend of elite training and cutting-edge technology. She stared at the screen, her mind reeling. The boy she had loved, the man who had returned from war, the benefactor who had saved her school. He wasn't just successful. Ethan was a billionaire. The discovery of Ethan's fortune left Tessa feeling off-kilter, as if the ground beneath her had fundamentally shifted. It wasn't the money itself that stunned her, but the secrecy. It created a new invisible wall between them, a part of his life so vast she couldn't comprehend it, a part he had deliberately kept from her. She spent the next day wrestling with this new reality, unsure how to feel, unsure how to approach him. On Christmas Eve, the snow began to fall, thick, silent flakes that blanketed Northwood in a pristine layer of white, muffling the world in a peaceful hush. She was in the living room with Jolie, stringing popcorn for the tree, when the doorbell rang. It was Ethan. He stood on the porch, snowflakes melting in his hair, a dusting of white on the shoulders of his dark wool coat. He wasn't holding a lavish bouquet or an expensive gift. He was holding a small, slightly battered-looking red cardboard box. Tessa's heart was still a tangle of confusion from her late-night discovery, but the sight of him, looking so much like the boy she remembered, made her forget everything else. "Merry Christmas, Tess," he said, his voice a low, warm rumble. He held out the box. "Open it." Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of old cotton, was a single handmade Christmas ornament. It was a clumsy, lopsided clay star, painted a cheerful chipping yellow with their initials, T+E, scratched into the back with a paper clip. The ornament she had made for him in art class when she was 16, the last Christmas present she had ever given him. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief and filling with tears. "I've kept it all these years," he confessed, his voice soft. "Everywhere I went, it was a reminder." A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down her cheek. In that one simple gesture, he had answered all her unspoken questions. The money, the company, the billion-dollar contracts, none of it mattered. This was him. This was the man who had carried a piece of her heart, a clumsy clay star, with him through a war and back. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in the cold, damp wool of his coat. "I kept mine too," she whispered, referring to the matching star he had made for her, which now hung on her grandmother's tree. He spent the day with them. He helped Jolie in the kitchen, his sleeves rolled up, laughing as he fumbled with the pie crust. He helped Tessa finish decorating the tree, their hands brushing as they hung ornaments, each touch a small electric spark. He fit into the cozy domestic scene so perfectly, so naturally, it was as if he had never left. Watching him, Tessa finally understood. The money hadn't changed the core of who he was. He was still the kind, humble, gentle boy she had fallen in love with, now wrapped in the quiet strength of a man. She understood why he hadn't told her about his fortune. It wasn't a secret he was keeping from her. It was a burden he was trying to protect her from. It didn't define him, and he didn't want it to define them. That night, after Jolie had gone to bed, they stood by the tree, the only light in the room coming from the soft, multicolored glow of the Christmas lights. The air was thick with unspoken emotion, with 8 years of longing. "Tessa," he began, his voice a low whisper. "Don't talk," she whispered back, stepping closer. She reached up, her hand cupping his cheek, and she kissed him. It was a kiss of homecoming. It was tender and tentative at first, a question asked after years of silence. Then, as he responded, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her tight against him, it deepened. It became a kiss of rediscovery, of passion held in check for too long, of two halves of a soul finally clicking back into place. It was magic. It was everything. It was as if no time had passed at all. They were lost in the moment when the sharp, intrusive ring of his phone shattered the spell. He pulled back reluctantly, a frown creasing his brow as he looked at the screen. He answered, his tone shifting, becoming instantly serious, alert. "Yes, sir." Tessa watched as the easygoing man from moments before vanished, replaced by the soldier. His face grew tense, his posture rigid. "I understand," he said into the phone. "When?" He was silent for a long moment, listening. "Understood." He hung up and looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, profound regret. "That was the army," he said, his voice flat. "They need me." The blood drained from her face. "What? But you're not—" "I'm not enlisted, no," he confirmed, anticipating her question. "I'm a civilian consultant now. Technically, I can say no." He ran a hand through his hair, a look of deep conflict on his face. "It's a critical rescue operation. Some of the men I served with, my brothers, they're pinned down. The commander called me personally. He needs my expertise, my specific skill set." He looked her straight in the eye, his own gaze tortured. "I can say no, Tessa. But if I do, and something happens to them, I'll never forgive myself. They saved my life more times than I can count. It's a matter of honor." The world, which had just felt so perfect, so complete, began to tilt on its axis once again. She wanted to scream, to beg him not to go, to tell him he had done his part, that he didn't owe them anything more. But she looked at the man she loved, at the unshakable integrity that was so core to who he was, and she knew she couldn't. Swallowing the fear that was clawing at her throat, she asked the only question that mattered, her voice a trembling whisper. "When do you have to go?" He took her hands, his grip tight, grounding. "In 1 week," he said. "And Tessa, it's high risk." He squeezed her hands. "But I promise you, I will come back to you." A week. 7 days. 168 hours. That was all they had. The knowledge hung over them, a heavy, bittersweet cloud that made every moment more precious, every touch more profound. The day before he was due to leave, Ethan took her to the old covered bridge on the edge of town. It was a place layered with memories, a landmark of their shared history. It was where they had carved their initials into the wooden beams as teenagers. It was where they had said their first tearful goodbye 8 years ago. Snow fell in thick, silent flakes, blanketing the world in a pristine white. They stood in the middle of the bridge, sheltered from the storm, the only sound the soft whisper of the wind and the gentle flow of the frozen river below. "I hate this place," Tessa whispered, looking at the old, scarred initials inside a carved heart. "This is where I lost you." "No," Ethan said, turning her to face him. "This isn't where you lost me. This is just where we pressed pause." He looked at her, his eyes full of a love so deep it was bottomless. "And this is where we press play again. For good." He took a shaky breath, and before she could process what was happening, he dropped to one knee on the snow-dusted wooden planks. The world stopped. He reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, dark velvet box. "Tessa Parker," he began, his voice thick with emotion, his gaze never leaving hers. "I've loved you for more than half my life. I loved you when we were kids. I loved you through 8 years of silence, and I love you more than I have words for right now." He opened the box. Inside, a simple, elegant diamond solitaire rested on a platinum band. It wasn't a massive, ostentatious stone. It was tasteful, timeless, and it glittered in the dim light like a captured star. "I know the timing is insane," he continued, a tear tracing a path down his cheek. "I know I'm about to leave, and I know where I'm going is dangerous. But that's exactly why I have to do this now. I need you to have this. I need you to have a promise, a symbol that I am coming back to you no matter what. This ring isn't a goodbye, Tess. It's my anchor. It's the lighthouse that will guide me home to you." His voice broke. "Marry me, Tessa. When I get back, marry me, and let's finally have the life that was stolen from us." She was crying, silent, happy tears streaming down her face. She looked at the man kneeling before her, the man who had crossed the world and back, who had built an empire, but whose heart had never left this small town, had never left her. She knew his sense of duty, his unshakable honor. It was part of why she loved him. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that she would not be the one to stand in the way of it. She would be his lighthouse. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with love. "Yes, Ethan, I'll marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He stood, pulling her into a desperate, all-encompassing hug. They spent their last week in a whirlwind of stolen moments. They didn't talk about the danger. They talked about the future, the house they would build, the children they would have, the Christmases they would spend together. Jolie blessed their engagement with tears in her eyes, holding Ethan's face in her hands and making him swear he would come home to her granddaughter. The day of his departure was a cold, grey dawn at a small private airfield. As they stood by the plane, he held her close, his face buried in her hair. "There's something else," he said, his voice muffled. He pulled back to look at her, his expression serious. "I've made arrangements. My lawyers know. If something happens to me, Tessa, everything is yours. The company, the properties, all of it." "Don't," she whispered, her heart clenching in fear. "Don't talk like that." "I have to," he insisted, his hands framing her face. "I have to go into this prepared for anything, but you listen to me." He looked deep into her eyes. "You trust me. I will come back. I always come back to you." He kissed her one last time, a kiss full of love and promises, and the bitter taste of goodbye. Then he turned and walked up the steps into the plane without looking back. Tessa stood on the tarmac, the cold wind whipping around her, her hand wrapped around the diamond ring on her finger. She watched until the plane was just a tiny speck in the vast, unforgiving sky. 3 months passed. 3 months of silence. 3 months of waking up every morning with a knot of fear in her stomach. She went back to teaching, trying to find normalcy and routine, trying to hold on to his promise. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, as she was explaining the symbolism in The Great Gatsby to her students, the classroom door opened. The principal, Mrs. Gable, stood there, her face pale, her expression grave. "Miss Parker," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You need to come with me, now." Tessa's blood ran cold. The look on Mrs. Gable's face was one she knew all too well from her brief, unwilling time in the world of military families in England. It was a look of practiced sympathy, of dreaded news. She walked out of the classroom on unsteady legs, her mind a roaring void. In the principal's office, 2 men in immaculate army dress uniforms stood waiting. They rose as she entered. Their faces were stoic, their posture rigid, their expressions etched with a deep, professional sorrow. Her knees gave out. She gripped the back of a chair to keep from collapsing. "Miss Parker," the older of the 2 officers began, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm Colonel Hayes. We're here regarding Sergeant Ethan Miller." The world tilted. The room swam before her eyes. She heard the name, the rank, but her mind refused to process the past tense he might use next. "Don't say it, don't say it, don't say it." "There was an incident during the operation," the colonel continued, his words precise and devastating. "Sergeant Miller's team was ambushed in a remote, hostile territory. There were casualties." Tessa couldn't breathe. The air in the room was too thick, too heavy. "At this time," he said, choosing his words with excruciating care, "Sergeant Miller's status is unaccounted for. He is officially listed as missing in action. MIA. The 3 letters were a special kind of hell. Not dead. Not alive. Just gone. A ghost. A question mark hanging over her life. The officers explained that search and rescue operations were underway, but the area was dangerous. The chances of finding survivors slim. The days that followed were a blur of suffocating grief and frantic, desperate hope. Jolie was her rock, holding her, making her drink tea, sitting with her in the long, silent hours of the night. The news spread through Northwood like a sad, quiet whisper. Ethan was one of their own. The town that had once felt like a cage of painful memories now wrapped its arms around her. People left casseroles on the porch. The local church organized a vigil. Tessa moved through it all like a phantom, her hand constantly twisting the diamond ring on her finger. It was her anchor, her last tangible connection to him, his promise. "I always come back to you." A month after he disappeared, a sleek black car pulled up to the house. A man in a sharp suit, with a kind but weary face, introduced himself as Ethan's personal lawyer. He carried a thick leather briefcase. "Miss Parker," he said gently, sitting across from her in the quiet living room. Ethan was very specific in his final directives before he left. He explained that Ethan had legally structured everything. In the event of his death or his being declared missing in action for more than 30 days, full control of his entire estate, including the majority share and voting rights of Miller Tech Security, was to be transferred to her. Tessa stared at him, horrified. "I don't want it," she whispered. "I don't want his money. I want him." "I know," the lawyer said, his voice full of sympathy. "But there is a complication. The private equity fund that owns the minority share. They're getting nervous. With Ethan gone, they see the company as unstable. They're pushing the board to accept a buyout offer from a competitor. The thought of Ethan's company, the empire he had built from his own grit and genius, being dismantled and sold off to the highest bidder, felt like a second death. It was his legacy. It was the physical manifestation of the man he had become. In that moment, something inside Tessa shifted. The grief, the helplessness. It receded, replaced by a cold, fierce resolve. She would not let them erase him. She looked the lawyer straight in the eye. "They're not selling it," she said, her voice no longer a whisper, but a statement of pure, unshakable will. "I'll run it myself. I'll protect it. For him. Until he comes back." Because he was coming back. She had to believe that. A week later, Tessa stood in the intimidating, glass-walled boardroom at the Miller Tech headquarters. She faced a table of skeptical, middle-aged men in expensive suits who looked at her as if she were a child playing dress-up. She was about to begin her first address as the acting chairperson, her hands trembling under the table, when her phone, sitting face down, vibrated. Annoyed at the interruption, she glanced at the screen. Unknown number. She almost declined it, but some instinct made her answer, holding the phone to her ear. "Hello?" Static. A faint, distant crackle. And then, a voice. So weak it was barely a whisper, so distorted by static it was almost unrecognizable. But she knew it. She would know it anywhere. "Tess." The line went dead. "Ethan?" She cried into the phone, her voice a strangled sob. "Ethan." She tried to call back, again and again, her fingers fumbling on the screen. Nothing. Just a dead line. The boardroom, the skeptical faces, the billions of dollars. It all faded away. It was him. She knew it. He was alive. The phantom phone call became Tessa's lifeline and her torment. It was a single, brilliant spark of hope in an endless, suffocating darkness. She told the army. She told the lawyer. They were kind, but skeptical. A static-filled call from an unknown number wasn't evidence. It could have been a cruel prank, a crossed wire, a figment of her grief-stricken imagination. But Tessa knew. She had heard him. That single whispered word was etched into her soul. He was alive. The call galvanized her. She threw herself into running Miller Tech with a ferocity that stunned the board of directors. She spent her days in meetings, learning the intricate details of a multi-billion-dollar global security firm, and her nights poring over contracts and personnel files. She wasn't just a placeholder. She was a guardian, a fierce protector of his legacy. Every decision she made, every strategy she approved, was guided by a single question. What would Ethan do? But as the weeks turned into months, The hope ignited by the phone call began to flicker. The silence from the army was absolute. The search and rescue operations were quietly scaled back. The world was moving on, preparing to accept the unacceptable. 3 months to the day after Ethan disappeared, the phone call she had been dreading came. It was Colonel Hayes. "Miss Parker," he said, his voice heavy with a practiced, gentle authority. "We need to talk, in person." She met him at the local recruitment office, a small, sterile room that felt cold despite the spring sunshine outside. The colonel was direct, his kindness unable to soften the brutal edge of his words. "Officially, the search has been concluded," he said. "After 90 days with no contact, no evidence of survival. It's protocol, Miss Parker. Sergeant Miller will be declared killed in action." "No," she said, the word a flat, dead sound. "He's alive. I know he is. I would feel it if he were gone." "Tessa," the colonel said, using her first name for the first time, his voice full of a deep human sympathy. "I've seen this 1,000 times. Hope is a powerful thing, but sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is let go." She walked out of that office with the colonel's words echoing in her ears, each one a shovelful of dirt on the coffin they were trying to build for her love. She went home to Jolie, who held her as she finally, truly, broke. The sobs that racked her body were not just for Ethan, but for the hope that was being systematically extinguished. That night, clutching the pillow on his side of the bed, she looked at the diamond ring on her finger, its sparkle a cruel mockery in the darkness. "You promised," she whispered to the empty room. "You promised you would come back." The weight of it all became too much. The company, the meetings, the constant battle to keep his legacy alive while her own hope was dying, it was consuming her. The following week, on an impulse, she called Mrs. Gable. She needed to feel like herself again, even for a few hours a day. She needed a purpose beyond waiting. She needed to teach. Returning to the classroom was both a comfort and a new form of torture. The routine was grounding, the students a welcome distraction. But every time the classroom door opened, her head would snap up, her heart leaping with a wild, foolish hope, only to crash back down when it was just a student or another teacher. April bled into May, May into June. The seasons changed, but her world remained frozen in a state of suspended animation. She was losing faith. The logical part of her brain was beginning to accept the army's grim reality. But she kept the ring on her finger, a stubborn, desperate act of defiance against a world that had declared her love story over. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday in early June. The sun was shining, the students were restless, their minds already on summer vacation. Tessa was at the front of the class, her back to the door, writing a quote from the Odyssey on the chalkboard. "Of all creatures that breathe and move upon the earth, nothing is bred that is weaker than man." She was about to explain the quote when she noticed it. A sudden, absolute silence had fallen over the classroom. The usual fidgeting and whispering had ceased. Every single one of her students was staring, wide-eyed, at the door behind her. And then she heard it. A voice that had haunted her dreams for months, a voice she thought she might never hear again outside of her own memory. It was rougher, deeper, but unmistakably his. "Miss Parker?" The piece of chalk slipped from Tessa's numb fingers, clattering softly on the floor. The sound was an explosion in the dead silence of the room. She stood frozen, her back to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break free. It couldn't be. It was a dream, a hallucination brought on by months of grief and desperate hope. Slowly, as if moving through water, she turned. The world spun into a dizzying, slow-motion blur. There, leaning against the doorframe for support, stood a ghost. It was Ethan. Thinner, yes. His face was covered by a rough, untamed beard, and there were dark, haunted shadows under his eyes that spoke of things she couldn't imagine. But it was him. His eyes, the same intense, loving eyes she saw in her dreams, were locked on her. He was alive. A collective gasp went through the classroom as Tessa's face crumpled. A sound, half sob, half laugh escaped her lips. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. There was only him. And then she ran. She didn't walk. She didn't hurry. She flew. She launched herself across the classroom, books and papers scattering in her wake, and threw herself into his arms. The impact was solid, real. He was real. He was warm. He was here. He staggered back a step, his arms wrapping around her, holding her so tightly she could feel the frantic, relieved beat of his heart against hers. He buried his face in her hair, and she could feel his body trembling. "I came back," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken sound against her ear. "I promised I'd come back." The classroom erupted. Her students, who had been watching in stunned, reverent silence, burst into a spontaneous, joyous storm of applause, cheers, and happy tears. They left the school in a daze, finding a quiet, secluded bench by the river, away from the inevitable questions and attention. He held her hand as if he might never let it go, his thumb constantly stroking her skin, reassuring himself that she was real. He told her the story. It came out in fragmented, painful pieces. His team had been ambushed, just as the army had said. He'd been wounded, separated from his unit, and left for dead. For months he was trapped behind enemy lines, hidden by a local family who had risked their own lives to nurse him back to health. There was no communication, no way to let the world know he was alive. The brief, static-filled phone call she had received was from a stolen satellite phone, a desperate, one-in-a-million shot before he was forced to go dark again. "All I thought about was you," he confessed, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Every single day. I would look at the moon and wonder if you were looking at it too. I held onto the memory of you, of this ring, of my promise. That's what kept me alive." Tessa listened, her own tears falling freely, tears of overwhelming relief, of profound joy, of a love that had literally conquered death. But in the days and weeks that followed his miraculous return, a new, more subtle challenge emerged. The man who had come back was not the same man who had left. He was quieter, his eyes holding a distant, haunted look. He would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his body rigid, a silent scream trapped in his throat. Loud noises made him flinch. Crowds made him anxious. He was physically present, but emotionally, he would drift away, retreating to a dark place she couldn't reach. One night, after a particularly bad nightmare had left him shaken and distant, he finally broke. "I don't know if I can be the man you deserve, Tessa," he confessed, his voice full of a self-loathing that broke her heart. He wouldn't look at her. "I saw things. I did things. I lost men who were like brothers to me." He finally met her gaze, his eyes filled with a deep, profound pain. "I'm not him anymore. I'm not the man you fell in love with." She moved to him, kneeling before him and taking his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "You're wrong," she said, her voice fierce with a love that was stronger than any darkness. "You are exactly the man I love. You're a man who survived. You're a man who kept his promise. And we are going to get through this. Together." She found a therapist who specialized in veterans with PTSD. He resisted at first, his pride and his training telling him to handle it alone. But she was relentless in her gentle, unwavering support. "You fought your way through hell to come back to me, Ethan Miller," she told him, her hands on his shoulders. "Now you're going to let me fight with you to come all the way home." Looking into her determined, loving eyes, he saw a strength that matched his own. He saw a fight he couldn't win alone. He finally, reluctantly, agreed. The first session was brutal, but it was a start. As they walked out of the therapist's office and into the afternoon sun, he reached for her hand, his grip tight. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "for not giving up on me." "Never," she replied, squeezing his hand back. "Welcome home, soldier." The next 6 months were a quiet, arduous, and beautiful battle. There were good days, filled with laughter and glimpses of the old easygoing Ethan. And there were bad days, when the ghosts of his past were too loud, and he would retreat into a silent, haunted shell. But through it all, Tessa was his constant, his anchor. She learned his triggers. She held him through the nightmares, and she celebrated every small victory, every step he took back toward the light. The therapy helped, but it was Tessa's unwavering, unconditional love that truly began to heal him. He started to talk about what he had been through, not just to his therapist, but to her. He shared the pain, the guilt, the loss, and in sharing it, he slowly, painstakingly, began to let it go. He found a new purpose. He poured his energy and resources into transforming MillerTech. It was no longer just a security firm. He launched a new, non-profit division dedicated to providing comprehensive reintegration programs for veterans, job training, housing assistance, and, most importantly, free and accessible mental health support. He was using his own darkness to help lead others back into the light. One crisp afternoon in December, exactly 1 year after he had first proposed, he came to find her at the school. He walked into her classroom after the last student had left, his expression serious and full of a familiar, heart-stopping emotion. He didn't say a word. He simply walked over to her, got down on one knee, and looked up at her, his eyes clear and full of a love that was stronger and deeper than ever. "You still want to marry me, Tessa Parker?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. She laughed through a fresh wave of happy tears. "Always," she whispered. "I will always want to marry you." Their wedding, held the following spring, was a celebration of survival and enduring love. The small-town church was packed to the rafters. Jolie, her health having rallied with the return of her grandson and the happiness of her granddaughter, sat in the front row, her face a mask of pure joy. The veterans from Ethan's new program, men whose lives he had helped put back together, stood in a silent, uniformed honor guard as Tessa walked down the aisle. When the minister asked Ethan if he would take Tessa as his wife, his voice was firm and clear, ringing through the silent church. "I walked through hell to get back to her," he said, looking at his bride. "Yes, I do." There wasn't a dry eye in the house. 2 years later, Tessa stood in that same classroom, erasing the chalkboard at the end of the day. She was 8 months pregnant, her body full with the promise of their new life. The classroom door opened, and Ethan walked in, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers, a Friday tradition he never missed. The students, who had long since adopted him as their own, adored him. "Came to pick up my wife and my son," he said, his grin wide as he kissed her soundly. Tessa laughed, placing a hand on her belly. "It's a girl, remember?" she corrected him. "We're naming her Grace, because that's what saved us." As they walked out of the school, hand in hand, Tessa glanced back at the empty classroom, the place where her world had shattered and then been made whole again. The final scene is years later, the cozy living room of their grandparents' old house, which they had lovingly restored. Ethan, Tessa, a bright-eyed 3-year-old named Grace, and a newborn baby boy swaddled in Tessa's arms. Jolie, older but still full of light, watches from her favorite armchair as they decorate the Christmas tree. With her father's help, Grace carefully places a clumsy, lopsided clay star at the very top of the tree. Ethan comes up behind Tessa, wrapping his arms around his growing family. "Remember when you thought you could never be happy in this town again?" he whispers, kissing her cheek. Tessa smiles, a deep, contented smile as she looks at the life they've built. Her husband, who had come back from the dead for her. Her children, a testament to their unbreakable bond. Her grandmother, the anchor of their family. "I was wrong," she says softly. "I didn't come back here because I had to. I came back because this was always my home. With you." He tightens his embrace, his promise a warm breath against her ear. "And I'm never leaving again." Under the soft, multicolored glow of the Christmas tree, surrounded by a love that had survived distance, war, and time itself, They kissed. Some loves are so strong, they find their way back, no matter what.